If you're thinking about those big compromises, what do you think would be an essential one that can bridge the divide? Richard has an amazing background, the founder of two banks, energy company, past potential presidential candidate, best-selling author of numerous books. You considered running for president in 2020. What was your takeaway about the country?
We did a very thorough job over about a year and a half of organizing focus groups across the country, from New Hampshire to Nevada to South Carolina to Michigan. I think we ended up going to about 15 states and conducting focus groups that I myself moderated. You would think something happens over in the Philippines that everybody in America cares about it. I went around and very methodically asked folks, not about policies. I went and asked them about their lives.
Hi, I'm Gilad, and this is the Possible Podcast, where I have conversations with ethical leaders who have achieved excellence. And today it's an absolute honor to have Richard Vague. Thank you for joining.
It's an honor to be here.
Richard has an amazing background. He is quite the Renaissance man, the founder of two banks, an energy company, past potential presidential candidate, a prolific philanthropist, sitting on the board of Penn Medicine, as well as the Franklin Institute, and chairing Pennsylvania's largest pension fund, and also the best-selling author of numerous books, including his most recent, The Banker Who Made America. And it's a real pleasure. So excited to have you today.
It's like I said, it's a real privilege to be with you.
As someone who's spent so much time with our founders, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, I'm curious to hear how these friends have impacted you and what you've taken from learning about their lives.
Well, it was truly a tumultuous time in American history, an extraordinary time that was what most folks don't focus on. It was one of the biggest economic booms in world history. So they were coping with a lot of things, including the stress of rapid growth and rapid wealth accumulation and inequality and all those other things. And I think time and things were in extreme at that point, not just between us and Britain, but within factions in the United States. The book that I've just written is about the extreme political contention between the wealthy merchant elite in the coastal city of Philadelphia and what were called at the time middling and lower sorts, who were largely Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and other kind of non-official religious denominations. And they were at each other in a very vitriolic way. And I think what I'm most impressed about is that time and time again, folks were able to compromise and find common ground and move forward. And to me, that's, the lesson of that particular book for our times is, irrespective of how extreme things are, the way to get ahead is by really doing those things necessary to find common ground.
Absolutely. And one of those big compromises, it seemed, was how representative our system would be. And today, if you're thinking about those big compromises, what do you think would be an essential one that can bridge the divide between, more elite groups and, the average person?
Well, I think the growing inequality in the United States is a big, big issue. We have an economic division that studies this intensely, and inequality has grown very, very dramatically. And I think finding ways to make sure that the middle and lower classes in the United States get ahead is one of the most important things we can do politically. And that might include job training. That might include, tax incentives for ownership of assets. Who knows? There's a broad range of things you could do. But I think it's in the best interest of those that are the most fortunate to make sure our middle class is vibrant and to make sure our lower classes are taken care of.
Absolutely. And that story of getting ahead speaks to your story. And it's one thing that I was thinking about is that throughout history, most bankers have come from elite families. And I was curious how you, given that wasn't your background, became such a prominent banker yourself.
Well, I ran out of money going to college. So I, I've dropped out and tried to find a job to get a little money to go back to school. And that job that I got happened to be at a bank. And, next thing you know, a few years go by and I'm president of that bank. So you
I'd
never
love to
know.
hear more about kind of the specifics of that story. And one thing that stood out to me was how there was a mentor who you said right when you graduated college, he was the president of the bank and he appointed you head of marketing. How did you build that early relationship with him that he wanted to take that bet on you?
Well, it was luck and good fortune on my part that I came across somebody as wonderful as this gentleman, who I saw again only recently, by the way, a gentleman named John Tollison. But yeah, I mean, I was a student at the University of Texas. I was working full time and going to school full time, and um, he, the circumstances of the bank were that he needed some special projects done. So I think I wrote a speech for him and did this and that and the other, and we got to know each other. And they had an acute need in marketing. It just so happened that marketing and advertising was the degree I got, and that was because I had been an artist, and I thought the practical application of my art interest was advertising and commercial art and that sort of thing. So their need just happened to coincide with the thing that I was studying, and much to my shock, he had developed enough confidence in my ability from the projects that he'd given me that he took a shot on giving me that job. And it was extreme good fortune.
It's amazing. And also, it sounds like you were proactive and putting yourself out there and helping yourself, make yourself useful in wherever you could. So that's quite the skill. And something that I read a lot about was how you have an amazing ability to read the room. So seeing opportunities, understanding people. Do you have any advice for young people starting their career, thinking about how to really understand the motivations and get a better sense of the dynamics in the room so that they can perform at the highest levels?
Well, I think what I had, and I want to emphasize that, I was able to achieve things because of the help of others, and I give more credit to that than to my own ability. But I think the one thing that I always focused on was doing the work rather than focusing on getting ahead. So I know even I've had thousands of folks work for me, and you have person A over here who just wants to be helpful, and you have person B over here that wants to run the joint, and guess what? It's the person over here who just wants to be helpful and is getting the work done, and there's always a lot of work to be done, and you can rely on, and they've just got their nose to the grindstone. That's the kind of person I think I was. That's the kind of person I look for when I look within my own organization as to who to bring forward and promote and give additional responsibility to. So I think that would be my advice. Just try to do the best you can and have an attitude of service, and a lot of good will happen.
That seems to have been a consistent theme throughout your career. And it also seems that on the flip side, you had the ability to adjust and to change. And I saw you made a comment that when you were 40, you took a step back and thought, maybe I was like a little aggressive in some ways, or you used the word bully. How did you go about changing a piece of your character? And what was that process? And how did you kind of take a step back and say, whoa, I really could be doing better here?
Well, it was interesting. We were at a point where we were very successful, and I was president of a bank, and we were doing very well. And I felt like I ought to try to gain some additional abilities by engaging an executive coach. I had always, I think, been fairly assertive or forceful in trying to get things done. I'm the kind of guy that'll push my way through, obstacles as they appear. And so within the organization, I would always have ideas about, what we should do and, how we should do things. And So I complained to my executive coach. I said, we have the meeting. It was a bank, and so we had credit meetings, and we had operational meetings and marketing meetings, and I would come in as president, and I'd have all my ideas, and I complained to my executive coach. I said, you know, many times I will come in and I'll have this great idea and I'll get no feedback on it. And she looked at me, she said, "Oh, yes, you do." It was like hitting me over the head with a 2x4. I learned that when folks not responding was the equivalent of them saying no or saying they wanted to explore a different direction. And I kept that lesson. And, one of the other things she said to me as a leader, that I ought to speak last. That, when I came in, I should hear what everybody else has to say. And wouldn't you know that, regularly when I did that, half or more of the time, somebody else would articulate an idea that was better than the one that I came into the room with. And so it was very easy to accept that idea because I hadn't already spoken. And in those cases where we came to the end of the meeting and I still felt like my idea was the one that we should pursue, I had that option. So I was able to incorporate that very quickly just because of how much of a jolt her statement to me had made.
Wow, it's powerful to have that humility and that willingness to change. A lot of people, they get feedback and they might be like, no, never, and like they don't accept it, but it's powerful to be able to take that on. A lot of people, I would say, young people especially, they look at people like you who've been very successful and they think it's all linear and that there's just kind of one path and you're straight up. One challenge I'd be curious to hear about was after the Bank One resignation, kind of how you thought about moving forward yourself in your career and what were the things you focused on and what kept you grounded maybe in what could have been a difficult time?
Well, I had a lot of setbacks in my career. There were a lot of cases where, whether it was organizationally or from an earnings standpoint or from a product launch or from a business launch. I mean, I had, I'm not sure I didn't have more failures than successes if you really wanted to tally it up. And yet I've always had the desire to do more. And so I don't think there was ever a question, particularly at that young age, about, dusting myself off and going at it again. And, there's that, I'm not sure I can get the quote exactly, but, the Mary Pickford quote about you can have a fresh start any time you want. It's not the being knocked down that matters. It's the staying down that matters. And, what she was basically saying was you can get right back up. And I've always tried to do that.
Absolutely. And I guess taking you a little later in your career, at one point you considered running for president in 2020, seeing what was happening in the country. Was there anything that you learned about yourself in that process? And what was your takeaway about the country? Because I know you spoke to thousands of people in that process.
We did a very thorough job over about a year and a half of organizing focus groups across the country, from New Hampshire to Nevada to South Carolina to Michigan. I think we ended up going to about 15 states and conducting focus groups that I myself moderated. And I wanted to know what folks genuinely cared about, because if you watch cable news, whether it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC or anything else, you would think there's all something happens over in the Philippines that everybody in America cares about it, or if Emmanuel Macron does X, everybody cares about it, or there were all these things that were reported breathlessly in these cable shows that implicitly they're saying these are the things Americans care about. And I just didn't know if that was right or not. So I went around and very methodically asked folks, not about policies and not about candidates and not about parties. So I didn't go in and say, how do you feel about immigration policy? And I didn't go in and say, how do you feel about the Republican Party? I went and asked them about their lives. what is the job market like for you? What is your health care insurance like? Or, is there anybody in your family or among your friends that has struggled with opioids? And so it was a list of questions really about their lives. And it was really clear that the things that mattered to people were the things that happened in their everyday life. That, even on climate change, we'd ask, that didn't matter nearly as much to folks as being able to pay for their healthcare expenses. And you could tell that in a focus group in a way you can't in a questionnaire, because you can see the body language. I'd ask about certain policy things, including climate change, and everybody would give the politically correct answer. I separated the groups into Democrats and Republicans, and so I had different groups. And you'd have a predictable set of responses if it was Republicans, and a predictable set of responses if it was Democrats. But folks wouldn't really be that engaged. But if you ask about whether they'd had some medical emergency, everybody in the room sits up straight, leans forward, raises their hand. They're really emotional and engaged about it. So you have a depth of understanding about what the answers are in a focus group you don't have otherwise. And it really boils down to their daily and weekly and monthly immediate lives. It's paying the bills, having a good job, getting their kid to Little League. Those are the things that matter to folks. And so and we looked at the middle class, broadly defined. It's not a perfect process, but you can tell the income and job levels of the folks that come into your focus groups. And I came away with something that I kind of had a hunch on even before I started, which was that neither party really focuses on the broad middle class as much as they should. And I don't mean to simplify or oversimplify or mischaracterize, but I think it's reasonably true that the Democratic Party looks more at the less fortunate and the folks that are excluded or disenfranchised, and the Republican Party tends to look more at the folks that are very well off related to their tax advantages. And the middle class kind of gets forgotten or neglected in that. And I think that's one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in today. We haven't taken care of the folks that matter most in the country. And so I had this very quixotic thought that if there wasn't a candidate that came forward that really wanted to try to represent that group, that I'd throw my hat in the ring. And it really boiled down to whether Joe Biden was going to run or not. And he did run. And so I didn't try to do anything. Not that I would have been able to do anything, frankly, but at least I'd have given it a shot.
Absolutely. And I guess switching to an area related to the middle class and a particular expertise of yours, given your time in banking and your numerous books on debt, for someone who doesn't think much about debt, why should they care about it? And for someone who's an expert and knows a lot about debt, what have you found in your research that they might find is interesting?
Well, debt is pervasive. And, whether you pay attention to it or not, it is a pervasive and oppressive factor really in every civilization going back thousands of years, but certainly in our own. And the place that we saw and felt that the most in our focus groups was the issue of student debt. That there's a whole lot of folks, millions it turns out, but a disproportionate number of every one of my focus groups who had 25, 50, 100, $150,000 worth of student debt that was precluding them from having and forming the lives that I think my generation was able to have and to form. They weren't able to buy a home. They didn't feel confident about having kids as early as past generations. It's a huge issue. And, you don't have to draw people's attention to it. They live under that burden each and every day. And I think And now I've written a book about, perhaps ways to try to mitigate that. And there's no magic wand, by the way, but it's a central fact of history and of economic reality today.
It's an amazing book, The Case for a Debt Jubilee. You should definitely check it out. I'm curious to hear if you think there's anything the states can do, because if the federal government is not taking any action on debt forgiveness, is there a way that more local governments you think could help in a significant way?
I'm very involved with city and state and federal government matters, even today. And, I wish the answer to that question was yes. I know there's a lot of governors and governors I'm close to that would love to do something. I know there's a lot of mayors that would love to do something. Nobody has nearly even the smallest fraction of the capacity that the federal government has to do something. So, sure, there's things states and cities could do, but it's really a very small amount at the very margin of the problem. And the real issues are ones to be dealt with at the federal government level. And as you've just intimated, there's not a lot of appetite for that at the moment.
And if there was one thing that could be done, that would be the smallest forgiveness of dollar amount of debt, but that would impact the most people in the most substantial way. What do you think would that kind of easiest solution that would be, the smallest number, but would have the greatest impact?
Well, I'm not sure there's anything here that's easy, that, or we'd have already done it. But, the two areas that I speak to in that book, one of them is on the mortgage side. And, we're in a better place on mortgage debt today than we were in 2009. In 2009, we had 9 million people that lost their homes. You had tens of millions of people that had mortgages that were underwater, and you had folks that were trying to make mortgage payments that weren't really able to. Folks that had gotten an introductory rate and all the craziness of the 06, 07 boom, and those introductory rates had expired and they went to the real rate, so their mortgage payments doubled and what have you. So, I introduce a thought about, a way that a lender could give relief in the current moment in exchange for a percent of the equity upon the sale of the home. And this would be at the borrower's option. So this is not a mandated program, but if somebody wanted to, get a mortgage payment that was, 20 or 40% below their current mortgage payment. So, instead of $1,000 a month, they're only paying $800 or $600 a month. They could exchange by giving that lender 30 or 40% of the gain when the home is eventually sold. It's almost like a commercial debt for equity swap structure. I think there'd be a lot of folks. I think there would have been millions of folks in that precarious moment that would have done that. And I think the political situation we're in today would be vastly different, and the middle class would be in vastly better shape if we had pursued something like that. So that's one. It's feasible. Whether it would ever be done politically is another matter. And on the student debt side, the issue is fairness. You have two students. One, it's 10 years after they've graduated. One of them took, part-time job and a weekend job and this and that and the other, never took a vacation and has paid off their student debt. And, student B didn't do that and did take all those vacations and made the minimum payment. So student A has no student debt left and student B has $50,000 in student debt left, and the government comes along and forgives the student debt. That's, highly unfair to student A. And so I think that's why those initiatives failed, is the inherent unfairness. So what we thought about was something that, is similar to the GI Bill that was so monumentally successful in the 1950s in the United States, in the late 1940s, where because of their service to the country, they got a deal, in terms of their education. They got a loan or a grant or what have you that made college feasible. And so we introduced kind of a conceptually similar idea, which is, a certain number of community service hours served would get you partial or total forgiveness of your student debt. We think, if we did that, we think there'd be a lot of student debt forgiven, but we also think there'd be a kind of a revolution in civic engagement.
One idea that I appreciate there as well is like this idea that when you serve your country, you come from all sorts of backgrounds, and bringing people together, across the political divide as well, in addition to service, but kind of a unifying service. And I think
I think that's a great point. And that was always one of the great things about the Army, was particularly when it was a draft, is you had folks from all walks of life together who learned to appreciate and form connections with each other.
Absolutely. It seems your perspective on debt and free markets has evolved over your career. And I'd be curious if there was a moment or something that struck you that said, whoa, maybe I've been thinking about this a little bit wrong. And is there any way that you would suggest to people to kind of maintain their intellectual flexibility, especially when there's so much tied to our opinions today? But how can we allow ourselves to constantly learn and to grow, and maybe even to change our perspective?
Well, in my case, I got a job, and I was focused on that job, and I think between that and getting married and getting a mortgage and having kids, that was my life. And I didn't think much about macroeconomic matters. I kind of assumed, somewhat naively, that the world was kind of the way it should be, and that even within banking, that things kind of went up and down within a well-established range. And so I never spent that much time thinking about macroeconomic issues or inequality or any of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about since. And I think it was the calamity of the '08 crisis that caused me. I was sitting there watching the world fall apart, and you'd ask folks why this was happening, and nobody had a good answer. And I've spent a lot of time since then trying to understand that, and I think I understand now. I think I understand very clearly now what happened, and so it really forced me to think about the whole world in a way that I'd never thought about it before.
Absolutely. And I guess I would be curious to hear, when we think about the bankers of old, they had the power of literally whether or not governments were going to make war or win the wars. Today, I think it's less clear what that power is. What would you say the power today of the most prestigious bankers is in comparison to that historical role?
Well, you're speaking, of course, of things like the Bank of England that financed, William and Mary's fames, fights against the French. And, in the case of the United States, the gentleman that I just wrote a book about helped finance the American Revolution. And governments back then were much more fragile than they are today. When the Bank of the United States was started in 1791, there was no thought that would be a government agency or the government would be able to capitalize it, because the government didn't have anywhere near enough money to do that. That was an absurd thought. And today we have almost the opposite thought, which is, the government has all the capacity, and especially vis-a-vis the private sector. So, yeah, I think your observation is correct. At pivotal moments in the development of the modern age, which really started in the late 1600s, the bankers had enormous power. Thomas Willings, the guy I wrote about, had dinner with presidents and treasury secretaries many times a week, it seems like, for years. So the influence and the intimacy were both there in a way they aren't today. So I don't think that vis-a-vis the government, modern bankers have the influence, except through the old-fashioned way of political contributions, which are rampant at this point in time. So, and it's not bankers, but kind of everybody in business that's gained great wealth. All the billionaires we have today, it's unprecedented. There's just not remotely anything to compare it. Maybe you can compare it to the Gilded Age and what have you. So it's not lending that gives them their power as much as political contributions themselves that have created quite an extraordinary situation at the moment.
And it is something that's interesting that even in spite of that change in power, the role of private debt is still enormous, as you've pointed out throughout your research. And I guess the two areas that I'm interested in hearing your perspective on is the rise of private credit and the role that's playing in financing the economy today as opposed to bank loans. And then also the rise of kind of investment in AI infrastructure. Are those areas that you think are positive, neutral, negative? How do you see the two of those?
Well, I'm going to use private credit in a slightly different way than perhaps you just did. For me, private credit is all the lending that's done that's not the government's debt. So credit cards and student loans and small business association loans and the mega loans to finance mergers are all in this bucket called private credit. And that's about 150% of GDP. So it's a bigger number. So you were astute in observing that, private credit in this broader sense is the primary determinant of economies and economic trends and economic outcomes. So I think a fundamental flaw of a lot of economic research and a lot of popular thinking is the obsession with government debt when, a lot of our problems and a lot of our opportunities surround private lending. I don't, one of the things that happened after the '08 crisis was regulators clamped down on commercial banks. And so commercial banks have, as a result, been able to have had tighter credit criteria. And that has given rise to this private credit industry, which are the Wall Street private equity firms and hedge funds and venture capital funds and others that are doing a lot of the lending now that banks used to do. And that is a profound shift just in terms of where the power resides within that industry. But I think as it relates to the macroeconomy as a whole, it's 6 of one and a half dozen of the other. So I don't have a concern there. Now, you asked me a second question, maybe I've missed.
AI infrastructure, and especially given your time in the energy space, kind of the build out of energy infrastructure that we might need, the building of data centers. Is that one of those focus areas, kind of like, commercial real estate was before the crash, that you think about, or not big enough?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think that you have to think in sheer terms of magnitude. There's about 40 trillion in private debt out there right now. About 20 trillion of that is business, 20 is consumer. The biggest chunk of that is real estate debt. And if you added the household mortgages and the commercial real estate together, it alone, real estate's $20 trillion. And the '08 crisis was about real estate. And really all the major crises and all over the world over the last couple of hundred years have all surrounded the issue of real estate and construction and related matters, simply because it's by far the biggest segment of private credit. The part that's related to AI right now is less than $1 trillion. So I do expect there to be a reversal there, and there almost always is. We're going to have, AI is going to change the world. It's going to do all these things folks predict, but it's gotten a little bit ahead of itself at the moment. There's, irrational, in my opinion, irrational overbuilding that's going to occur in and around things like data centers and chips and what have you. And there's going to be a correction, and whether that's big or small, who knows. But, one of the things I like to point out is in kind of the internet 1.0 revolution, when fiber optic cable was the big thing, we were going to have this unbelievable need for fiber optic cable. We laid down a whole lot of fiber optic cable, but 5 years after the 1.0 crash, 90% of that fiber optic cable was still not being used. So, I don't know what level of overbuilding is happening out there right now, but it's some level. And we'll have a lot of data centers that that won't be needed right away.
Interesting. Now, it sounds like a lot of your analysis today has definitely been shaped on a historical perspective and understanding the way that things kind of repeat and they sometimes change a little bit. I guess thinking about history more broadly, you seem like a very prolific reader and have read many presidential biographies. I would be curious if there were any that were particularly impactful for you in how you think about either your own life or how you think about the country, or any pursuits that you've undertaken.
Well, I took it upon myself. I do read a lot, and a lot of it's just research I have to do for the books. I'm working on a book now about the founding of the Bank of England, and I'll probably have to end up reading a couple hundred books just for that project. So, it's amazing how much, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. So, but years ago, I kind of undertook the project of reading a biography on every president. And what's interesting is there's a whole lot of presidents that, there's only one skinny little biography available. There was an effort made by a publisher to write at least a small biography on every U.S. president, and you guys like Garfield, who were only a president for 2-3 months. So, there's not much to write. And so, yeah, but you might expect from your earlier comments, I think that the thing that I've really appreciate about biography generally, not just biography of presidents, is how much adversity there is and how much luck there is. So I think those are the two takeaways that I take, not just from presidential biographies, but from almost any biography I've ever read, is folks have adversity, and most folks have a lot of adversity that they have to deal with. And I think we can take heart from that we're not alone when we're dealing with a problem. And I think most folks had breaks in their life that got them where they ultimately got. And I think that should bring a spirit of humility and gratefulness for all of us.
Absolutely. Are there any anecdotes that you particularly love that speak to you? Sense of, what that possibility is when you have that challenge or whatever topic covered?
I don't know. There's a lot of human stories that come out of this. One I've just been studying about relative to the book I just wrote, where it was at a point in his life that Thomas Jefferson was vice president and living in Philadelphia. Well, at that time, and folks may not remember or appreciate this, there was a very vitriolic division between what were called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or the Federalists and the Republicans. And Jefferson was kind of the leading voice on the Republican side. He was living in Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia was a bastion of the Federalists. That's where the Federalist Party had its caucus. I mean, it was a Federalist town, and Virginia was more the Anti-Federalist, but Jefferson was in Philly, and he didn't want to be in Philly. He didn't like being in Philly. He was shunned. And it's hard. He was excluded socially in a very pointed way by most of the prominent Philadelphians. And, he felt it, he saw it, he resented it. And one of the reasons it came up for me is because my guy, Thomas Willing, and his son-in-law, William Bingham, were really the only two Federalists that continued to reach out to Jefferson and try to include him. And he and his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, who came along just a couple of years later. And Jefferson and Gallatin both commented that, there were some guys that were still gracious to us, and we remember that.
I think it's an interesting thing of how much personally he hated Philadelphia, because maybe that gave Hamilton some additional leverage in switching, the capital for the assumption of the debt, where, not only was it having the power closer to Virginia, but maybe there was a personal aspect of, okay, let's get this to a place a little more friendly.
Well, very, very possibly, being a planter, which is what Jefferson was, he was a debtor. And at that time, there were no American banks allowed in the period before the Revolution. But all these planters, Washington, Jefferson, and others, were beholden to British creditors, which, by the way, most of which, by a quirk of regulation, most of them were Scottish. So, most of the tobacco lending and most of the tobacco importing for a period of time was out of Glasgow. And so Jefferson had lenders in Scotland. And there was a major crisis, which most folks don't remember, that I try to feature to a certain extent in my book, in 1772. That really was the thing that precipitated the war, in my opinion, because, Parliament was no longer, Parliament had reversed the Stamp Act. Parliament had reversed the Sugar and Currency Acts. Parliament had, even reversed the Townshend Acts. But Parliament didn't reverse the Intolerable Acts. That's because they happened after the crisis when there wasn't a financial capacity, and everybody was in a bad mood because everybody had been hurt. And but it wasn't just the British that were hurt by that crisis. The Scottish lenders didn't renew, re-up, increase, or otherwise accommodate their Virginia and Maryland borrowers. And Jefferson and his buddies got hurt really bad so they never liked lenders. Well, I think they really began to hate lenders after that. And for those guys, Philadelphians were just like the Scottish. They were the lenders. They were the creditors. The Virginians were the debtors. And there was a deep, deep divide. And in fact, John Adams actually articulates this. He says, a banking aristocracy is no better than the one we just defeated. And he counted Willing and those kind of guys as the new aristocracy that was threatened to revert the country back to the bad situation they'd been in prior to the Revolution.
Right. And it's interesting also just the central role Philadelphia has continued to play in many ways. And as a man who loves Philadelphia, what would you say Philadelphia means to the country? And what do you think it means to the world today as we're approaching the 250th anniversary?
Well, make no mistake, Philadelphia's heyday was prior to 1800. So
coming back,
maybe it'll come back someday. And, we do love our city. But I would get back to the same idea we discussed a few minutes ago, that the signal achievement that happened in Philadelphia, both at the Declaration of Independence in July of 76 and at the Constitutional Convention in September of 87, was the fact that folks that, kind of hated each other's guts in a way that doesn't come across in the history books, by the way, were able to find common ground, that the country was able to become the most successful democracy ever because folks begrudgingly and with gritted teeth and with hardened hearts nevertheless inched toward that middle where they were able to compromise and to come up with the Declaration and the Constitution.
One of the lines that really struck me from your book, The Banker Who Made America, was when you were speaking about the greatness of the United States. You said it was the capacity for adaptation, for compromise, for moderation and goodwill. And may we continue to find that in the country. Always the final question. The podcast is called The Possible, and it's the idea that anything is possible. I would love to hear if there's a moment from your life or something that you've read that will always stand with you when you think of the nature of what is possible.
You're talking about something that happened in my own life?
If there is a story that you have there or something that you've read, so it could be either.
I think that when I took a part-time job at a bank to put myself through school, so I would have been 20 or 21 at the most, and I'd been given a job to write procedure manuals for the bank, it's a regulatory requirement, or they wouldn't do it. I don't think, but so I was going around the bank and getting to know folks, and just one day I kind of woke up and said, I could do all this, and I think that was the moment in my life that I really felt like, your word that things were possible, that if I really put myself to it, that I could do, maybe not anything, but I think you're always, I don't know about you, but, I was a little bit cocky, with that phase of my life. And, you're 20-year-old, the world's your oyster and what have you. And then, but I did really come to the conviction that, I could, if I put my mind to it, there was very little I couldn't do.
That's beautiful. I hope everyone can have that moment of inspiration where they see the possibility within themselves and they go out and achieve it. So thank you so much for this conversation today.
Well, thank you.